The moonlight felt like a shroud. It fell in cold silver sheets through the high-arched windows of the great hall, bleaching the color from the tapestries and turning the assembled lords and ladies into stone-faced statues. They called it a union, a sacred right to heal the kingdom and its broken king. But Eveline knew it for what it was, a haunting. She was the ghost, summoned to walk in a dead woman's shoes, to fill a space that was not hers. The air was thick with the scent of winter roses and ceremonial incense, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the undercurrent of pity and contempt that rolled off the court in waves. She stood on the dais, a silent effigy in a gown of borrowed moonlight silk. It was Queen Lyra's gown, tailored for a woman with a bolder spirit and a prouder frame. On Eveline, it felt like a costume, the delicate embroidery of silver thorns catching on her trembling fingers. For weeks, she had been a doll for the court seamstresses and ladies-in-waiting to fuss over. They had pulled her hair into the same intricate braids Lyra had favored, painted her lips with the same shade of crushed berry, and drilled her on the subtle cant of a head, the soft cadence of a voice that was not her own. They had polished a mirror, and now they held it up to their grieving king, desperate for him to see a reflection that would soothe his madness. Across from her, King Raylan Morven was a monolith carved from winter and shadow. He was larger than the whispers had described, a terrifying mountain of a man whose presence consumed the light and air around him. A jagged scar, a remnant of the battle that had claimed his mate, cut a brutal path from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his mouth in a permanent, grim line. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on a point just over her shoulder, seeing not her, but the ghost she was meant to personify. His scent reached her even from several feet away, a kingdom of its own, built of ancient pines, the first frost, and the metallic tang of a sorrow so deep it had rusted into rage. The High Elder, a withered wolf whose voice rasped like dry leaves, droned on with the ancient rites. His words were meant to be about union, fate, and the blessing of the moon goddess, but to Eveline, they were a death sentence. They were chaining her to a memory, erasing the quiet, insignificant girl she had been and replacing her with a counterfeit queen. Her Omega wolf, always a timid presence within her, had fallen completely silent, cowering in the face of the overwhelming, oppressive power of the Alpha King. She felt hollowed out, a vessel waiting to be filled with another's essence. And do you, Raylan Morven, Alpha King of the Northern clans, take this woman as your mate, your queen, to stand by your side under the moon's watchful eye, the elder intoned. The hall fell into a breathless silence. The king's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing along his scarred face. His gaze finally, reluctantly dropped to meet hers. For a shattering second, his stormy eyes cleared, and he saw her, Eveline Darethin, the nobody from a forgotten border pack. A flicker of something raw and furious crossed his features before the mask of cold indifference slammed back down. "I do," he bit out. The words were not a vow, they were an execution. The elder turned his rheumy eyes to her. "And do you, Eveline of the Darethin line, accept Raylan Morven as your alpha, your king, and your mate, to bind your soul to his for all eternity?" Her throat was a desert. All the carefully rehearsed words, the soft, lyra-like affirmations, turned to ash on her tongue. The court watched, their collective gaze a physical weight pressing down on her. To refuse was death. To accept was to cease to exist. She opened her mouth, and a sound so small it was barely a breath escaped. "I accept." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the hall. The charade was almost complete. Now came the final, most intimate humiliation. The claiming, the mark. The elder stepped back, making way for the king. Raylan moved toward her, not as a groom approaches his bride, but as a wolf approaches a trap it has been forced to step into. Each step was heavy, deliberate, shaking the very stones beneath her feet. The scent of him intensified, a blizzard of pine and grief that stole the air from her lungs. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes, the fine lines of strain around them. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, his power a crushing weight. Whispers skittered through the court like mice in the walls. "Just like her," someone breathed. "The moon is merciful to grant him this comfort." Comfort. Eveline wanted to laugh, a hysterical, broken sound. This was not comfort. It was torture. She was a constant living reminder of his greatest failure, his deepest loss. He would look at her every day and see the woman he couldn't save. He lifted a hand and she flinched, her body tensing for a blow or a dismissal. But his fingers, calloused and cold, merely brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was impersonal, a duty performed, yet a shock of heat, sharp and unwelcome, jolted through her. His eyes followed the line of her throat down to the delicate, vulnerable curve of her neck, where her pulse hammered against her skin. This was it. The moment she would be branded. The moment her skin would be torn open and sealed with the bond of a male who would never truly see her. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping to trace a cold path down her temple. She tilted her head, exposing her neck in the ultimate act of submission, an omega yielding to her alpha. She braced for the sting of his fangs, for the searing pain that would irrevocably tie her fate to his hollow reign. She smelled the change in him, the primal shift, as the wolf within him rose to the surface, ready to claim. His breath was hot against her skin. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The bite never came. Instead, a sound ripped through the hall, a strangled, guttural growl that came not from a place of dominance, but of sheer animalistic shock. It was his voice, torn from the depths of his being. Eveline's eyes snapped open. The king had recoiled from her as if burned. His hand clutched to his chest. His face, once a mask of cold control, was now a canvas of disbelief and horror. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring down at his own right forearm, which he had raised as if to ward off a blow. A collective gasp swept through the court, a wave of confusion and fear. Following his stunned gaze, Eveline saw it. There, on the scarred, sun-bronzed skin of his forearm, a light was blooming. It started as a faint glimmer, then intensified, coalescing into intricate, shimmering silver lines. The lines wove themselves into a familiar pattern, a crescent moon cradling a winter rose, the sacred sigil of the moon goddess, the indelible mark of a true, fated mate bond. It pulsed with a soft, ethereal light, a living thing being etched into his very flesh by an unseen hand. The court stared, frozen in stunned silence. The mark was sacred, a legend, a blessing bestowed only upon the most perfectly matched souls. But it was on the wrong person. It was supposed to be a bite mark, delivered from alpha to mate, scarring her neck. It was never, ever supposed to manifest on its own, a flawless glowing brand appearing on the alpha himself. It was impossible, a violation of every law of nature and magic she had ever known. King Raylan stared at the glowing brand on his arm, his breath coming in ragged pants. He slowly lifted his gaze from the impossible mark to her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her, not as a ghost, not as a replacement, but as the source of this terrifying, undeniable magic. The cold indifference in his eyes was gone, replaced by a maelstrom of confusion, fury, and a dawning, terrible awe. "What?" he rasped, his voice a low thunder that promised a breaking storm. "Have you done?" The king's accusation hung in the air, sharp and glittering as a shard of ice. For a heartbeat, the great hall was a frozen tableau, a world trapped in amber. Then chaos erupted. A collective roar of disbelief and fear tore through the assembled court. Lords surged to their feet, their hands flying to the pommels of their swords. Ladies cried out, shielding their eyes as if the glowing mark were a blasphemy too profane to witness. The high elder stumbled back, his face ashen, his lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer to a goddess who had seemingly abandoned all reason. "Witchcraft!" a voice boomed from the crowd. "A curse!" another shrieked. "The Omega is cursed!" Eveline stood frozen at the eye of the hurricane, the accusations washing over her. Her mind was a white void of terror. She had done nothing. She was nothing, a quiet girl from a dying pack, a mirror polished to reflect another woman's light. How could she be the source of such impossible, terrifying magic? Raylan ignored the pandemonium. His world had narrowed to two things: the searing alien light on his own skin and the pale, trembling woman before him. The scent of her, wild herbs and rain-soaked earth, was suddenly overwhelming, a maddening counterpoint to the phantom fragrance of winter roses that had haunted him for a year. His wolf, a beast of rage and grief he had kept chained in the deepest dungeon of his soul, was stirring. It wasn't snarling in rejection. It was confused, intrigued. It recognized the moon's magic, felt the undeniable pull of the sigil on his flesh, a sigil that was inextricably linked to her. His human heart, however, felt only betrayal. This was a desecration, a stain upon the sacred memory of Lyra. "You," he snarled, and the single word cut through the din, silencing the hall with its raw, unrestrained fury. He closed the distance between them in a single stride, his hand shooting out to clamp around her upper arm. His grip was like iron, a cage of muscle and bone that sent a jolt of pure primal fear through her. "What are you?" She tried to answer, to deny it, but her throat had sealed shut. Only a choked gasp escaped. He was a tempest, a force of nature, and she was a leaf caught in the vortex. He began to pull her from the dais, his strides long and brutal, forcing her to stumble to keep up. The court parted before them like a receding tide, faces a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. They were no longer in a ceremony, they were in the middle of a hunt, and she was the prey. He dragged her from the great hall, through cavernous corridors of cold stone lined with the impassive faces of his ancestors in their portraits. Guards slammed their fists to their chests as he passed, their eyes averted. Servants flattened themselves against the walls, their fear a palpable scent in the air. The borrowed silk of her gown whispered against the flagstones, a mournful sound that echoed the frantic, terrified beat of her heart. He did not take her to the dungeons, as she expected. He hauled her up a winding staircase, into the royal wing of the castle, a place she had only seen in hushed whispers and awestruck glances. The air here was different, warmer, softer, yet heavier with the weight of memory. He shoved open a set of ornate, carved wooden doors and threw her inside. Eveline stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a velvet chaise longue before she could fall. She looked up, her breath catching in her chest. They were in a vast bedchamber, a space of breathtaking beauty and suffocating sorrow. A four-poster bed draped in silks the color of dawn dominated one wall. A fire crackled in a marble hearth, casting a warm glow over shelves of leather-bound books and delicate silver trinkets. And everywhere was the scent of winter roses, so thick and cloying it was like drowning in perfume. This was Queen Lyra's room, her sanctuary. Her ghost was in every thread of the tapestries, every reflection in the polished silver mirror above the vanity. Raylan slammed the doors shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He stood with his back to them, his massive frame silhouetted by the firelight, his chest heaving. He slowly turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a tormented fire. "Talk," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Tell me what dark pact you made. Which of my enemies paid you to perform this defilement?" I made no pact," Eveline whispered, her voice thin and reedy. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly, and the sound of her own voice felt foreign and weak against the stone walls of this sacred space. "I don't know what happened." "Lies," he roared, stalking toward her. He stopped just short of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He thrust his arm into the firelight, the silver mark pulsing with a soft, steady rhythm, a second heartbeat against his skin. "The moon does not make mistakes, nor does she grant her deepest blessing as a curse upon an alpha. This is your doing, a trick, an illusion." He reached out, his fingers digging into her other arm, and hauled her to her feet. He forced her in front of the ornate silver mirror that hung above a dressing table laden with crystal bottles and ivory combs. "Look," he hissed, his hot breath stirring the fine hairs at her temple. "They told me you were her twin, a perfect copy." Eveline stared at their reflection. She saw a terrified doe trapped in the grasp of a great, wounded bear. She saw her own wide, frightened eyes, her pale face, her dark hair arranged in a dead woman's style. And beside her, the towering king, his face a mask of anguish, the scar on his face a livid mark of his pain. They looked nothing like a mated pair. They looked like a captor and his prisoner. "You have her face," he whispered, his voice cracking with a pain so profound it was terrifying. "Her hair. But you are not her. You are a hollow thing, a vessel, and something has filled you with poison." His grip tightened, and as his skin pressed against hers, the mark on his forearm flared. It wasn't a soft pulse this time. It was a brilliant, blinding flash of silver light. A current of pure energy arced between them. A shock wave that made them both cry out. It was not pain. It was something else entirely. A feeling of pure, primal recognition. A soul-deep resonance that vibrated through every bone in her body. For a split second, she felt the crushing weight of his grief, as if it were her own, saw a fleeting image of a laughing woman with eyes like his, and felt the phantom agony of a wound that was not hers. Raylan staggered back, releasing her as if he touched white-hot iron. He stared at his hand, then at her, his expression of fury now warring with raw, utter confusion. "What was that?" he breathed, his voice stripped of its rage, leaving only stunned disbelief. Eveline clutched her arm where he had held her, the skin tingling with a strange, lingering warmth. Her own wolf, silent for so long, was awake. It wasn't cowering anymore. It was standing at attention, head cocked, listening to a song only it could hear, a song that emanated from the furious, broken alpha before her. "I don't know," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by a fragile, budding certainty. "It is the bond. It is not the bond," he roared, his control snapping back into place. "My bond is buried with my mate, my queen." He gestured wildly around the room. "This was her life. Her scent is still on the damn pillows. Do you think some trick of the light on my arm can replace that?" He was breathing heavily, pacing the room like a caged lion, his fists clenching and unclenching. He was at war with himself, his grief fighting against the undeniable magic branded on his skin. He stopped in front of a small painted portrait on the mantelpiece. It was of Lyra. She was beautiful, radiant, her smile full of life and confidence. She was everything Eveline was not. He stared at the portrait for a long moment, his shoulders slumping, the fight seeming to drain out of him, leaving a vast, empty wasteland of sorrow. When he finally turned back to Eveline, his eyes were no longer burning with rage. They were dead, as cold and gray as a winter sea. "You are a problem I do not have the strength to solve tonight," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "You cannot be cast out. The mark, it tethers you here, to me." He said the last words as if they were a death sentence. He walked toward the door, his movements heavy, weary. His hand was on the handle when he stopped and looked back at her, his gaze sweeping over her with cold dismissal. "This will be your cage," he said, his voice as final as a closing crypt. "You will stay in these rooms, you will want for nothing, and you will have nothing. You will not be spoken to, and you will not speak to anyone. You are a ghost, after all. It is time you started acting like one." With that, he walked out, pulling the heavy doors closed behind him. Eveline heard the sharp, definitive click of a key turning in the lock. And then silence. A thick, suffocating silence, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the overwhelming scent of a dead queen's roses. She was alone, a prisoner in a ghost's room, bound to a king whose heart was a tomb. Days bled into a featureless gray. Eveline became a creature of shadows and silence, learning the geography of her gilded cage. Lyra's rooms were a suite, not just a bedchamber. There was a sitting room with a small, sun-drenched balcony overlooking the frozen royal gardens, a bathing chamber with a sunken tub of polished marble, and a dressing room lined with wardrobes filled with another woman's clothes. Food appeared on a tray outside her door, left by silent servants who fled before she could even turn the handle. They were terrified of her, the cursed Omega, the walking blasphemy. She was utterly, completely alone. The king, she learned, had forbidden anyone from speaking her name. The court had dubbed her the Marked One, a title spoken in hushed, fearful whispers. They treated her existence like a sickness, a shameful secret to be hidden away. She was a queen in name, a prisoner in reality. Her world shrunk to the scent of roses and the cold, judging eyes of the portraits on the walls. Her only companion was the silence, and within that silence, her own wolf began to stir. Freed from the oppressive weight of the court and the constant need to be small and invisible, it stretched its limbs. It was a timid thing, yes, but it was curious. It paced the edges of her consciousness, sniffing at the strange new reality they found themselves in. It was fascinated by the bond, this shimmering, invisible thread that now connected her to the king. She could feel him, not his thoughts, but the raw, unfiltered echo of his emotions. It was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of her own feelings, a distant storm on the horizon. Most of the time, it was a maelstrom of grief and rage, so potent it left a bitter taste in her mouth. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when his guard was down, she would feel a wave of profound, soul-deep loneliness that was so sharp, so aching, it made her own heart clench in sympathy. He was as much a prisoner of his past as she was of her present. One evening, driven by a desperate need for something to do other than stare at the walls, Evelyn found herself in front of the ornate silver mirror in the dressing room. It was Lyra's mirror. Her reflection stared back, a pale imitation in a simple linen shift she'd found in the back of a wardrobe. She still wore Lyra's face, but the fear and uncertainty in her eyes were entirely her own. She lifted a hand, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheek. Was this face truly so like hers? She had never seen a portrait of the late queen up close, only the small, idealized painting on the mantel. As her fingers brushed the cool glass, a strange sensation prickled at her skin, like static electricity. The air in the room grew heavy, the flame of the candle on the vanity flickering wildly. The scent of roses, always present, suddenly intensified, becoming thick and suffocating. A whisper, delicate as the brush of a moth's wing, slithered into her mind. He will never love you. Evelyn snatched her hand back from the mirror as if it were hot iron, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, her eyes darting into the shadowed corners of the room. She was alone. There was no one there. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a trembling whisper. The only answer was the crackle of the fire from the next room. She must have imagined it. The solitude was making her mad. Her nerves were frayed, her mind playing tricks on her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She turned back to the mirror, and her blood ran cold. For a split second, her reflection had been wrong. The eyes staring back at her were not her own fearful brown, but a stormy, defiant gray-blue, filled with a cold, possessive light. The mouth was curved into a knowing, disdainful smirk. It was Lyra's face, not as a copy, but as the original, vibrant, and alive with a spirit that was not hers. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her own terrified face in its place. But the chilling presence lingered, a cold spot in the air, a phantom touch on the back of her neck. "This is my room," the whisper came again, clearer this time, coiling in the space behind her eyes. "My life, my king, you are just a shadow wearing my clothes." Evelyn scrambled backward, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. This wasn't her imagination, it was real. It was the ghost of Queen Lyra. Panic seized her. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to beat on the locked door and scream until her throat was raw, to beg for release from this haunted chamber. But where would she go? The world outside this room feared her more than any spirit. Her wolf, however, reacted differently. It rose up within her, not with aggression, but with a surprising surge of defiance. It flattened its ears and let out a low, silent growl into the recesses of her mind. This was their space now, their bond. This ghost had no claim here. Bolstered by her wolf's unexpected courage, Evelyn forced herself to stand her ground. She planted her feet, her gaze locked on the mirror, on her own reflection. "He is my mate now," she whispered, the words feeling both treasonous and liberating. "The moon marked him for me." A cold, mirthless laugh echoed in her mind, a sound like shattering glass. The moon is sentimental. She sees a face and remembers a soul. But he will never forget the original. Every time he looks at you, he will see me. Every time he touches you, it will be my skin he remembers. The presence intensified, pressing in on her, trying to suffocate her will. Evelyn felt a wave of despair wash over her, the ghost's sorrow and bitterness seeping into her own soul. It was a potent poison, distilled from a love that had been violently cut short. Suddenly, a jolt, sharp and distinct, shot through the bond connecting her to Raylan. It was a spike of pure, unadulterated fury, so powerful it made her gasp. He was somewhere in the castle, his rage a beacon in the night, and it was directed somehow at this room, at this presence. As if sensing the king's distant anger, the ghost's influence wavered. The oppressive coldness in the air receded slightly. The whisper grew fainter, laced with a bitter resentment. "You may wear the crown, little shadow, but you will always sleep in a cold bed." And then it was gone. The air returned to normal. The candle flame steadied, and the scent of roses retreated to its usual cloying background hum. Evelyn was left trembling, her breath coming in ragged pants, her mind reeling from the spectral assault. She was not just a replacement. She was an obstacle, an intruder in a love story that hadn't ended with death. The encounter left her shaken, but also strangely solidified. The ghost's challenge had given her a purpose beyond simple survival. This was a battle, and not just for the king's heart. It was a battle for her own existence, her own identity. She would not be a hollow vessel for a dead queen's spirit. She would not be erased. The next day, she began to fight back in the only way she could. She started with the scent. She went through the rooms, gathering up every bowl of dried rose petals, every sachet of rose potpourri, tucked into drawers, and piled them in the cold hearth of the sitting room. She couldn't light a fire, but the symbolic act was enough. Then she went to the wardrobes. She pulled out Lyra's magnificent gowns of velvet and silk, her riding leathers and formal cloaks, and folded them carefully, stacking them in the back of the largest armoire. She left herself with only the simplest shifts, plain dresses of wool and linen that held no echo of the former queen. She was stripping the room of its ghost, layer by layer. As she worked, she felt the bond hum. Raylan's distant rage had subsided, replaced by a low, simmering confusion, like the embers of a banked fire. It was as if he could feel what she was doing, feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere of his late wife's chambers, and it disturbed him. Her final act of defiance was the mirror. She couldn't remove it from the wall, but she could cover it. She took a heavy woolen blanket from a chest at the foot of the bed and draped it over the silvered glass, plunging the room into a softer, less judgmental light. As the fabric fell into place, she felt a sharp, stabbing pain lance through her head, and the whisper returned, weak but furious. "You cannot erase me." "Watch me," Evelyn breathed, her voice filled with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She turned away from the shrouded mirror, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a warrior. A quiet, terrified warrior in a locked room, but a warrior nonetheless. She had survived the king's rejection and the ghost's first assault. She didn't know what would come next, but as she sat on the chaise and watched the last of the winter sun fade from the sky, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A sliver of hope. The bond was her anchor, her wolf was her shield, and she would not be broken. She would not be a mirror. She would be herself, and somehow that would have to be enough. The castle held its breath around her. For 2 full days after she had shrouded the mirror and purged the rooms of their suffocating perfume, an unnatural quiet descended. The distant thrum of Raylan's emotions through the bond was a low, turbulent current of confusion, a disturbed hornet's nest. He had not come. She had thrown a stone into the deep, still pool of his grief, and now she could only wait for the ripples to return as a tidal wave. The air in the chambers had changed. It was lighter, cleaner. For the first time, the suite began to carry her own scent. The faint, clean smell of the unscented soap she used, the wildness of rain-soaked earth that always clung to her Omega wolf, and the quiet, herbal notes of her own skin. She could breathe. She could think. The constant, oppressive presence of Lyra had receded to a low hum, a resentful energy that seemed to emanate from the shrouded mirror. It was watching, waiting. Evelyn found a small book of northern legends left on a side table and spent the hours reading, her fingers tracing the faded ink. It was a small act of claiming the space, of making a moment in this room her own. She was so lost in a tale of a wolf who fell in love with the North Star that she didn't hear the key turn in the lock. The doors burst open with a force that rattled the hinges, slamming against the stone walls. King Raylan stood on the threshold, and he was the storm she had been waiting for. He didn't look at her at first. His stormy eyes swept the room, his nostrils flaring. She saw the exact moment the change registered. His entire body went rigid, a predator catching an alien scent on its own territory. The scent of roses was gone, completely. His gaze snapped to her, and the raw fury in them was so potent it was a physical blow. "What have you done?" he snarled, his voice a low, guttural threat that vibrated through the floorboards. He stalked into the room, his greatcoat swirling around him like a thundercloud. His own scent, pine and frost and iron, crashed into the quiet atmosphere she had cultivated. reclaiming the space with brutal authority. He saw the bare hearth, the altered wardrobes, and finally his eyes landed on the heavy wool blanket draped over the silver mirror. A muscle in his scarred jaw leaped. "You dare," he breathed, the words laced with a disbelief so profound it was more terrifying than his rage. "You dare to try and erase her." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. The timid Omega in her screamed to submit, to fall to her knees and apologize for her very existence. But the defiant spark that had been lit 2 days prior refused to be extinguished. She rose slowly from her chair, the book of legends falling unheeded to the floor. "I have erased no one," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I have only made a space for myself to breathe." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of all humor. "Breathe. You're a guest here, a shadow. You have no right to change anything. This room, this was her sanctuary." He swept an arm around, indicating the entire suite. "Every object, every scent was a piece of her. It was all I had left. And it was suffocating me," she countered, taking a single brave step forward. "She is gone, my king. I am here. Your grief has a right to this space, but her ghost does not have the right to my soul." The mention of a ghost made him flinch. A flicker of something, recognition, fear, crossed his face before being consumed by the fire of his anger. "Do not speak of things you do not understand. You are nothing but a spoiled child, tearing apart a tapestry because you do not like the colors." He closed the distance between them until he was looming over her, a mountain of fury. She had to crane her neck to meet his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show the terror that was threatening to paralyze her. His proximity was overwhelming. The sheer power radiating from him was a physical force, pressing on her, demanding she break. The silver mark on his forearm, visible below his rolled-up sleeve, seemed to pulse with a brighter light, feeding on the intensity of his emotions. "You will put everything back," he commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You will uncover the mirror. You will bring back her scent. You will be the reflection I commanded you to be. Or by the moon, I will find a way to break this cursed bond and cast you back to the dirt you came from." It was the threat, the casual cruelty of his words, that finally broke her fear and unleashed something else. A quiet, desperate anger of her own. "No," she said. The word was so soft it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire, but it hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, utterly stunned into silence. No one said no to the Alpha King. "I am your mate," she said, her voice gaining strength. The bond between them hummed, a vibrant, living thing awakened by their conflict. "The goddess herself marked you as mine. I may be an Omega, I may be a replacement in your eyes, but I am not a ghost, and I will not be treated as one. I will not live my life suffocating on the memory of another woman." Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she reached out and laid her hand gently on his forearm, directly over the glowing mark. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. It was like lightning striking a tree. A blinding flash of silver light erupted from the mark, engulfing them both. A current of raw, untamed energy surged up her arm, into her chest, setting every nerve alight. It wasn't a shock this time. It was a flood. She felt the full, crushing weight of his pain, the gaping wound in his soul where Lyra had been torn away. She saw flashes of memory, Lyra's laughter in the snow, the warmth of her hand in his, the sheer terror and agony of the battle where he lost her. But beneath the grief, she felt something else, something deep and primal that was entirely his, the wolf. And it was not grieving. It was reacting to her touch, her scent. It rose up to meet her, a powerful, possessive wave of recognition. It knew her, it claimed her. It wrapped around her own small, timid wolf, not with aggression, but with a startling, fierce protectiveness. Raylan gasped, his body shuddering as the wave of sensation hit him. He stared down at her hand on his arm, his stormy eyes wide with shock. The scent of her, the wild herbs, the clean rain, was no longer just a background note. It was the only thing in the world, a scent that cut through the fog of his grief and spoke directly to the beast within him. It was the scent of mate, not a memory, not a ghost, real, alive, here. He stumbled back, pulling his arm from her grasp, as if he'd been burned. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in ragged movements. The rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, naked confusion and a fear that was deeper than any anger. "Her scent," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's gone. I can't smell the roses anymore." He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, not as a shrine to his dead wife, but as a space now dominated by the living presence of the woman before him. The realization seemed to shatter something deep inside him. The carefully constructed walls of his grief, which had protected him for a year, were cracking. Before either of them could speak, a frantic pounding came from the chamber door. "Your Majesty, King Raylan!" a guard's voice called out, tight with urgency. Raylan visibly flinched, torn from the maelstrom of his inner world. He took a deep breath, shoving the torrent of emotions down, the mask of the cold, controlled king slamming back into place, though the cracks were still visible around the edges. "What is it?" he bit out, his voice rough. "An urgent message from the Shadowwood outpost, sire. Hunters have been spotted near the border, the same markings as the ones from before." A chilling silence fell over the room. The ones from before. The ones who had killed Lyra. Raylan's entire demeanor shifted. The personal turmoil was extinguished, replaced by the glacial ice of a warrior king. His grief, his confusion, his bond with Evelyn, it was all swept aside by the call to duty and the cold, burning promise of vengeance. He turned toward the door, his purpose clear, but as he reached it, he stopped. He looked back at Evelyn, and the look in his eyes was something new. It was no longer hatred or cold indifference. It was complicated, layered with confusion, reluctance, and a sliver of something that looked terrifyingly like responsibility. He was a king, and the mark on his arm made her, inexplicably, part of his kingdom, part of what he had to protect. His gaze flickered for a moment to the shrouded mirror, and a deep instinctual growl rumbled in his chest. His wolf was on high alert, sensing threats from all sides, both inside the room and out. "Do not," he said, his voice low and hard, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. "Leave these rooms." He left without another word, the doors closing with a quiet, final click behind him. He didn't lock them. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the room, her hand still tingling from the memory of the bond's fire. He hadn't locked the door. It was a small thing, a minuscule change, but it felt as momentous as the shifting of a continent. She was no longer just a prisoner, she was a complication he couldn't ignore. And as the distant threat of hunters loomed, she realized with a cold certainty that the ghost in the mirror might be the least of the dangers they now had to face. The unlocked door was a challenge, a test. For a full day, Evelyn didn't touch it. She paced the length of the rooms, the ghost of Raylan's presence, his fury, his shock, his reluctant command still clinging to the air. The bond between them had changed. Before, it had been a distant thrum, a one-sided connection where she felt the echoes of his emotions. Now it was a live wire. The jolt of their combined touch had awakened something, opened a channel. She could feel him more clearly now, a steady, grim resolve that hummed miles away at the edge of his kingdom. A cold, banked fire of impending violence aimed at the hunters on his border. But underneath that kingly duty, a new thread of awareness had woven itself into the bond. It was a thread connected to her, a reluctant, confused, but undeniable consciousness of her existence. He was aware of her in a way he hadn't been before. He hadn't locked the door because his wolf, the primal beast that recognized the moon's magic, would no longer allow her to be caged. On the second day, she opened it. Her hand trembled as she turned the heavy iron handle. The corridor outside was empty, hushed. The air felt charged, as if the entire castle was watching her. She took a tentative step out, then another. No guards appeared to stop her. No alarms were raised. She was a ghost no longer, but something far more unsettling to the court. An unknown quantity. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to feel stone under her feet that wasn't part of her chamber, to breathe air that wasn't recycled sorrow. She let her instincts guide her, her bare feet silent on the cold flagstones. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares where she might encounter members of the court. Their fear and hatred were poisons she wasn't ready to face. Her wandering led her to a part of the castle she'd never seen, a wing that felt older, quieter. It ended in a heavy oak door carved with intertwined branches of weirwood and pine. A library. Driven by a thirst for knowledge, for anything to distract her from the turmoil inside her, she pushed it open. The scent that greeted her was a balm to her soul. Old paper, leather, and beeswax. Vast shelves soared toward a vaulted ceiling, crammed with thousands of books. Moonlight streamed through a high circular window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny silent stars. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary of forgotten words. She wandered through the towering aisles, her fingers ghosting over ancient spines. She found a section on pack law and the history of the mate bond. It was here, she thought, that she might find answers. An explanation for the impossible mark on Raylan's arm. She pulled down a heavy leather-bound tome, its title, The Moon's Covenant, embossed in faded silver. Settling into a secluded alcove near the window, she opened it. The pages were brittle, the script archaic. She read about the sacredness of the claiming bite, the transfer of power and protection from alpha to mate. It was all as she had been taught. There was nothing, not a single line, about a mark appearing spontaneously on an alpha. It was a perversion of the natural order. Frustration gnawed at her. Was she truly a curse? A freak of nature? She was about to close the book in despair when a small, folded piece of parchment fell from between the pages. It was newer than the book itself, the ink still dark. Her heart quickened as she unfolded it. The handwriting was an elegant, feminine script. It was a journal entry or a letter never sent. The High Elder tells me the mirror ritual is a blessing, a last resort for a broken bloodline. He says the goddess understands the needs of a kingdom and will accept a vessel if the soul's echo is strong enough. He speaks of binding a spirit to a perfect physical reflection, a way to cheat death and continue a royal line when the true mate is lost. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The mirror ritual, a vessel, a physical reflection. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a tragic coincidence. Her resemblance to Lyra wasn't a quirk of fate. It was by design. They had summoned her here to be a replacement, not just in sentiment, but in a dark, forbidden ritual. Her hands trembled as she kept reading. But the warnings are dire. The texts say the ritual is a blasphemy that angers the moon. It seeks to trick her, to force her hand. They say if the vessel is not hollow, if she possesses a spark of her own fated destiny, the magic can twist. It will not create a copy. It will seek to fulfill the true bond, no matter the cost. A bond of reflection, where the mark appears not on the bride, but on the one who sees his soul reflected back at him. The Alpha King's mirror bride. The book fell from her lap. It all crashed down on her with suffocating weight. She wasn't a curse. She was the consequence. The court, in their desperation to soothe their king and secure the royal line, had used forbidden magic. They had intended for Lyra's spirit to possess her, to use her body as a vessel to reunite with Raylan. But her own soul, her own destiny as his true mate, had been too strong. The magic had backfired, rejecting the intended ghost and forging the true bond in the only way it could, on him. A cold presence slithered over her, the familiar chill of the ghost. Lyra had been listening. So now you know, the whisper coiled in her mind, laced with a bitter, triumphant cruelty. You were meant to be my body, my second chance, but your insignificant soul got in the way. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her gaze darting around the empty library. The ghost felt stronger here, away from the purged chambers, as if the castle's memories fed her power. You knew, Evelyn breathed. You knew about the ritual. Of course I knew. The voice was sharp, disdainful. I was there, on the other side, waiting. They were calling me back, calling me home to my king. And you stole it from me. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of a far corner. It was indistinct, a shimmering in the air, but it slowly coalesced into a form. It was her, yet not her, the shape of Lyra, ethereal and translucent, her stormy gray eyes burning with cold fire. She wore the gown she had died in, now tattered and spectral. He is mine, the spirit hissed, her form solidifying, becoming more real. His grief is the anchor that holds me here. As long as he mourns me, I will never truly be gone, and he will never stop mourning. Evelyn backed away, her heart pounding. The spirit advanced, a phantom of beauty and rage. They will find out what you are. The result of a failed ritual, a broken vessel. They will see you as an abomination. He will see you as the magic that blocked my return. Do you think he will ever love you then? He will hate you. He will despise you for stealing his only hope of getting me back." The ghost's words were venom, sinking deep, poisoning the fragile hope that had begun to grow within her. Was that what Raylan would believe? That she was the reason Lyra couldn't return to him? As the spirit drew closer, her chill began to sap the warmth from Evelyn's body. Despair, cold and absolute, began to creep into her heart. The ghost was right. She was a living monument to the king's failed hope. Just as the spectral form reached for her, a wave of heat, fierce and protective, surged through the bond from miles away. It was Raylan. He wasn't consciously sending it, but his wolf, his primal core, sensed her terror. It sensed the threat to its mate, even from the ethereal plane. The wave of raw, possessive energy slammed into the library, a silent roar that only spirits and bonded wolves could hear. Lyra's ghost shrieked, a sound of fury and pain, as the wave of pure alpha power hit her. Her form flickered violently, losing its cohesion. "He protects you even now?" she seethed, her image wavering like a reflection on disturbed water. Unknowing, unwilling. "It does not matter. The hunters are at the border. The same hunters who sent me to the shadows. Do you think they have been idle? They have their own magic, little Omega. They hunt not just wolves, but royal blood. When they come for him, his grief will be so great, his soul will be so broken, that I will finally have a way back in." Her form dissolved, melting back into the shadows, leaving only a final chilling whisper. "Enjoy your king while you can. His heart will be my home soon enough." Evelyn was left trembling in the moonlight, clutching the damning piece of parchment. She had the answer she sought, but it was 1,000 times worse than she could have imagined. She was not a curse, but she was the living proof of a blasphemous ritual. And now she knew a terrible secret. The hunters weren't just a random threat, they were coming for Raylan. And Lyra's ghost was not just a passive memory. She was an active, malevolent force, waiting for the perfect moment of tragedy to claim what she believed was hers. She had to warn him. She had to make him understand. But how could she explain a truth that was tangled in dark magic and a dead queen's ambition? He would never believe her. He would think it was another trick, another lie from the woman who had inexplicably stolen his dead mate's future. She was trapped, holding a truth that could either save him or utterly destroy them both. She did not return to the queen's chambers. To go back there now felt like retreating, like surrendering ground she had only just claimed. The library, with its scent of truth and dust, felt like the only sane place in the castle. She sat in the dark alcove, the moonlight her only companion, the folded parchment a cold weight in her hand. It was proof, but it was also a death sentence. To reveal it would be to accuse the highest powers in the kingdom, the High Elder, the Royal Council, of a blasphemy so profound it was unthinkable. They would deny it. They would call her a witch, a liar, and this time, the king would have every reason to believe them. The bond was a taut wire, humming with the grim finality of battle. She felt the echoes of Raylan's fight, the surge of adrenaline, the cold, clear focus of the warrior, the satisfying crunch of bone. He was alive, he was victorious, and he was coming back. She felt the shift in his emotional landscape as the fighting ended, the turn of his thoughts from the external enemy to the inexplicable turmoil waiting for him within his own castle walls, waiting for him in the form of a woman he didn't want, bound to him by a magic he didn't understand. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she could not wait for him to find her. She had to go to him. To hide now would be an admission of guilt. Clutching the parchment, she left the library. The castle was stirring with the news of the king's return. Guards marched in formation, their armor clattering. Servants hurried through the corridors, their faces a mixture of relief and anxiety. No one paid her any mind. She was a wraith moving through their world, her purpose a secret fire, hidden beneath her plain woolen dress. She didn't know where his private solar was, but her wolf did. It guided her, a silent pull in her chest, a certainty in her step that was not her own. It led her down corridors of power, past grim tapestries depicting his ancestors' victories, to a set of unadorned, iron-strapped doors. The air here was thick with his scent, stripped of the flowery perfume of Lyra's memory. This was the heart of the wolf, the den of the king. She raised a hand to knock but hesitated. What would she even say? Before her courage could fail, the doors were pulled open from the inside. A captain of the royal guard stood there, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood. He saw her and his eyes widened in shock, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. "You are not permitted," he began, his voice a low growl. "She is," a deeper voice commanded from within the room. The guard stiffened, his shock replaced by confusion. He stepped aside, his gaze fixed on her as if she were a venomous snake that had inexplicably been invited inside. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped across the threshold. Raylan stood before a massive stone hearth where a fire raged, battling the chill of his return. He had shed his heavy armor, leaving him in a simple black tunic and leather breeches, spattered with mud and something darker. A fresh cut bled sluggishly at his hairline. He was wiping blood from a dagger with a piece of oilcloth, his movements economical and deadly. He didn't look at her, but she felt his gaze on her, a palpable weight. The room was a reflection of him, Spartan, functional, powerful. A massive table dominated the center, covered in maps of the kingdom, weighted down with stones and daggers. There were no portraits here, no ghosts. He finished cleaning the blade and slid it into the sheath at his belt. Only then did he turn his full attention to her. The fury was gone. The cold indifference was gone. His stormy eyes were filled with a weary, raw exhaustion, and something else, a deep, unsettling question. "The bond," he said, his voice rough. "While I was fighting, I felt your fear. It was as sharp as a blade in my gut. My wolf, it wanted to turn back. It wanted to come back here." He took a step toward her, his gaze intense. "What happened? What frightened you?" This was it, her chance. Her throat was dry, her hands slick with sweat as she clutched the parchment. "I found something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the library, an explanation." She held the folded parchment out to him. Her hand was trembling so violently she was surprised she didn't drop it. He looked at her outstretched hand, then back to her face, his expression wary. He did not take it. "An explanation for what? For this mark? For this madness?" "For everything," she breathed. "For why I look like her. For why the mark appeared on you. It wasn't an accident. It was a ritual." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and profane. Raylan's face hardened, the weary confusion replaced by a familiar, dangerous stillness. "What did you say?" "The mirror ritual," she said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "They brought me here to be a vessel, to use dark magic to bind Queen Lyra's spirit to my body. They thought it would bring her back to you, but it failed. The moon wouldn't be tricked, because I was already your true mate. The magic twisted, and it forged the true bond instead. A bond of reflection. It marked you." She watched the storm gather in his eyes as her words struck him. Disbelief, denial, and then a volcanic, terrible rage. "You lie," he snarled, advancing on her. "This is a trick. A pathetic story you concocted to save your own skin. You dare accuse my high elder, my council, of such blasphemy?" "It's true. Read it," she pleaded, shoving the parchment at him again. This time, he snatched it from her hand, his fingers bruising hers. He held it up to the firelight, his eyes scanning the elegant script. She watched the muscles in his jaw clench, his knuckles turn white as he gripped the parchment. He was reading the words, but his mind was refusing to accept them. It was too monstrous a betrayal. "A forgery, Kahat," he hissed, though a sliver of doubt had entered his voice. The parchment trembled in his hand. "A witch's trick." As the words left his lips, the temperature in the room plummeted. The raging fire in the hearth dwindled to a pale, sickly flicker, its warmth sucked away. The air grew thick and heavy, and with it came the scent. Winter roses, overpowering, icy, a smell of beauty and death. A soft musical laugh echoed in the sudden silence, a sound only Raylan and Evelyn could hear. "She is clever, my love. A little liar, weaving tales to poison you against your most loyal subjects." Raylan froze, his head snapping up. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and a terrible, familiar longing. "Lyra?" he whispered. The name a wound torn open anew. The ghost did not appear. She was more cunning than that. She remained a voice, a scent, a presence that coiled around his heart, playing on his grief. "She is the witch, Raylan. She cast the spell that day. She blocked me. I was so close. I could feel you. She stole my body. She stole my life with you." "No," Eveline whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she saw the terrible conflict on Raylan's face. He was being torn in two. He looked at her, his eyes filled with suspicion and the old familiar pain. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a tortured rasp. "More of your magic?" "It's her," Eveline cried, taking a step toward him. "It's her ghost. She's real. She's been haunting me in the chambers. She's trying to twist the truth." "Don't listen to her," Lyra's voice crooned, full of false sympathy. "The little Omega is mad. The power was too much for her. She is broken." Raylan clutched his head, a low growl of pure torment rumbling in his chest. He was caught in a nightmare, his past and present warring for his soul. His gaze flickered between Eveline, real, solid, her terror a palpable wave he could feel through the bond, and the empty space where the seductive voice of his dead mate whispered poison. The parchment fell from his fingers, forgotten. Eveline knew she was losing. Lyra's hold on his memory, on his grief, was a fortress she had to break through. "The hunters," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "She told me about them. She said they weren't just random marauders. She said they hunt royal blood. They were coming for you, Raylan. She was waiting for it. Waiting for your grief to break you so she could take control." The mention of the hunters struck a chord. His head snapped toward her, his eyes clearing for a second. That was a detail he hadn't shared. A piece of intelligence his scouts had confirmed. How could she know? Seeing she was losing her grip, Lyra grew desperate. The chill in the room intensified to a painful, bone-deep cold. A faint shimmering outline began to form in the reflection of a polished silver goblet on the table. Lyra's beautiful, furious face, contorted with spectral rage. "She will ruin everything! Cast her out!" the ghost shrieked, her voice losing its seductive edge and becoming a blade of pure hatred. "I am your mate! I am your queen!" The spectral energy surged, not toward Raylan, but toward Eveline. It was a wave of pure, malevolent force, an invisible blow aimed to shatter her mind and soul. Eveline cried out, stumbling backward, her own wolf whimpering in terror at the unnatural assault. In that moment, everything broke for Raylan. He saw the shimmering reflection in the silver. He heard the shriek of the ghost he had loved, and he felt through the undeniable, searing truth of the bond, the wave of absolute terror and pain that was about to hit Eveline. His grief warred with his instinct. His memory warred with his reality. His instinct won. He didn't think, he didn't reason, he moved. With a roar that was pure primal alpha, he launched himself across the space between them. He slammed into Eveline, not as an attacker, but as a shield, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight against his chest, turning his own body to face the spectral assault. He tucked her head under his chin, his massive frame a living wall of muscle and bone between her and the ghost of his dead mate. The wave of cold energy hit his back, and he grunted, the impact staggering him. But he held firm, he held her. A low, vicious growl ripped from his throat, a sound of absolute possession and warning. It was not the king's voice. It was the wolf's, and it was directed at the spirit of the woman he had once loved. Silence. The cold receded. The scent of roses vanished. The fire in the hearth roared back to life. Eveline was trembling uncontrollably in his arms, her face buried against the rough fabric of his tunic. He was holding her, protecting her. He had chosen. He had shielded her from Lyra. The sheer earth-shattering significance of it stole her breath. Raylan stood frozen, his arms locked around her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was as stunned by his own actions as she was. He had just turned his back on his past, on his sacred grief, to protect the woman who was its living, breathing complication. The reflection in the silver goblet was gone. The whispers were silent. There was only the solid, warm weight of the woman in his arms, and the undeniable, thundering truth of the mark on his skin. The world narrowed to the space of his embrace. The scent of him, pine, frost, and the sharp metallic tang of his recent battle filled her senses, a grounding, powerful reality, after the spectral chill of the ghost. Eveline could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm that was slowly steadying from the jagged tempo of conflict to something slower, more deliberate. He held her with a possessive strength that was both terrifying and profoundly comforting. It was not the gentle hold of a lover, but the unyielding grip of a wolf claiming its territory, shielding what was his. He did not let her go, not for a long time. The silence in the room stretched, thick and profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and their shared ragged breaths. He was processing the impossible choice his instincts had made for him, the cataclysmic shift that had occurred when he'd thrown himself in front of her. He had shielded the present from the past. He had protected his fated mate from his dead one. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough rasp against her hair. The hunters, their blades were coated in silverbane, an herb that doesn't just wound wolves. It attacks the spirit. It severs the connection to our inner beast. He took a deep, shuddering breath. It's how they killed her. She wasn't just slain, her wolf spirit was annihilated. That's why she is trapped here, a ghost without a soul's other half, an echo. The admission was a torrent. He was thinking aloud, fitting the pieces together, the parchment, the ghost's words, the nature of the attack. Eveline stayed silent, letting him find his own way through the wreckage of his beliefs. Slowly, reluctantly, he loosened his hold. His hands moved to her shoulders, pushing her back just enough so he could look at her. His stormy eyes were no longer filled with rage or suspicion, but with a raw, turbulent sea of confusion and a dawning, terrible clarity. He was looking at her, truly looking at her, as if for the first time, without Lyra's shadow falling between them. He saw the tear tracks on her cheeks, the fierce resolve in her brown eyes, the faint tremor of her lips. "The ritual," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's true, all of it." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, a verdict delivered upon his own court. A betrayal so deep it was almost incomprehensible. His most trusted advisors, his high elder, had dabbled in blasphemy, lying to him, manipulating him in his grief, all for the sake of a bloodline. He released her and turned away, pacing before the fire like a caged lion. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of conspiracy and desperation. They feared my grief would leave the kingdom without an heir, that I would never accept another mate. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. They were right, so they found you, a perfect reflection, and they tried to play the goddess for a fool. His gaze fell on the crumpled parchment lying on the floor. He bent and picked it up, smoothing it out with his large, calloused hands. He read it again, this time not with denial, but with the cold, assessing eye of a king who has been deceived. "Lyra, her spirit," he murmured, his voice laced with a new kind of pain. Not just grief, but the agony of disillusionment. "She is not just a memory. She has been twisted by the way she died, by the ritual. She is a predator now, waiting." He looked at Eveline, and she saw in his eyes the terrible understanding of what the ghost truly wanted. Not to be reunited with him, but to possess him, to consume his strength and rule through him, a queen of shadow. The weight of it all seemed to settle on his shoulders, a physical burden. He was a king betrayed by his counsel, haunted by his corrupted past, and bound to a future he had never chosen. Eveline's heart ached for him, a clean, sharp pang of empathy that had nothing to do with Lyra, and everything to do with the broken, noble man before her. She took a hesitant step toward him. "Raylan," she said, his name a soft question in the tense air. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. The bond between them, now clean and unobstructed by the ghost's interference, pulsed with a quiet, steady warmth. It was a lifeline in the churning sea of his emotions. "The court cannot know of this," he said, his voice regaining its command. "Not yet. To reveal this betrayal would shatter the kingdom. It would mean civil war. The elders hold too much power, too much respect among the clans." "What will we do?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. She used the word "we" naturally, without thinking, and neither of them flinched from it. They were in this together now. That single act of protection had sealed it. He strode to the great table, his movements once again filled with purpose. He swept the maps aside, clearing a space. "We fight, not with swords, not yet. We fight with the truth. The bond is the moon's will. It is the highest law, above any elder, above any council." He looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than pain was in his eyes. It was respect. You were strong enough to resist a queen's spirit. The moon did not choose a hollow vessel. She chose a mate with a will of her own. The praise sent a jolt of warmth through her, a fragile blossom of pride. Tomorrow at the morning assembly, the court will be gathered, he continued, his mind working, the strategist, the king, taking over. They expect me to give a report on the hunters. Instead, I will address the matter of my mate. He looked directly at her, his expression grimly determined. They forced a sham ceremony. We will give them a true one. In front of the entire court, I will complete the claiming. I will mark you as mine, and your word will be my word. Your authority, my authority. We will bind ourselves so completely that no whisper, no ghost, no traitorous elder can stand against us. Eveline's breath hitched. A true claiming, the bite, the final, irrevocable seal of the mate bond. It was everything she should have feared, being branded by this fierce, intimidating king, but now it felt like a declaration of war. Their war. And she was ready to be his soldier. They will see you not as a replacement, he growled, a possessive fire lighting his eyes. They will see you as their queen. He crossed back to her, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb stroked her cheek, a touch so unexpectedly tender it made her tremble. It was a stark contrast to the iron grip of their first encounter. I do not know how to undo the damage of the past, he said, his voice low and raw with a vulnerability she'd never heard. I do not know if a heart that has been a tomb for so long can learn to live again. But my wolf, my soul, they know you, and I will not let anyone, living or dead, harm what is mine. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His scent, his strength, his presence enveloped her. It was a promise, a vow. It was more real and more powerful than any words a high elder could ever speak. She felt the rightness of it in every fiber of her being. A deep, resonant hum that started in the bond and spread through her veins like liquid moonlight. This was destiny, twisted, painful, and terrifying, but destiny all the same. She raised her hands and, for the first time, initiated contact herself. She laid her palms flat against his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. I am not afraid, she whispered, and to her own surprise, it was the truth. He pulled back slightly, his stormy eyes searching hers. A ghost of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corner of his mouth, easing the grim line of his scar. Good, he rumbled, because tomorrow we give them a dawn they will never forget. 6 moons had waxed and waned since the morning assembly that had shattered a kingdom's illusions. Eveline stood on the stone balcony of the Royal Solar, the same balcony where she had once been a prisoner. A soft autumn breeze, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth, stirred the strands of her dark hair. Draped over her shoulders was a heavy cloak of deep forest green, lined with the silver fur of a northern wolf. It was warm, comforting, and it carried the faint familiar scent of pine and frost. Raylan's scent. She rested a hand on the cold stone of the balustrade, her gaze sweeping over the bustling courtyard below. The castle was alive, but with a different kind of energy now. The cloying fear was gone, replaced by a grudging, growing respect. She was no longer the marked one, the cursed Omega. She was the queen. That morning had been a tempest. Raylan had stood before the assembled court, a king forged in fire and ice, and he had not spoken of hunters or boarders. He had spoken of blasphemy. He had not presented the parchment. That betrayal was a poison to be dealt with in silence and shadow. But he had presented her. He had called her to his side, and in the stunned silence of the great hall, he had told them of the moon's true will. He had spoken of a bond so strong it could not be denied, a destiny that had rectified a terrible mistake. And then, before the horrified eyes of the High Elder and the conspirators on his council, he had lowered his head and marked her. The claiming had been nothing like the cold, impersonal ritual she had once feared. It had been a storm of sensation, a flash of searing pain that had instantly dissolved into a wave of pure, possessive bliss. As his fangs had sunk into the delicate skin of her neck, the bond between them had exploded, a supernova of shared thoughts, feelings, and memories. In that blinding moment, she had felt the last, shattered remnants of his grief for Lyra. Not erased, but respectfully laid to rest in a quiet corner of his soul, and he had felt the entirety of her life, her loneliness, her quiet strength, her unwavering spirit. When he had raised his head, his eyes glowing with the fierce light of his wolf, the silver mark on his own arm had blazed with a light so bright the court had shielded their eyes. They were no longer two separate beings. They were one. In the weeks that followed, the traitors had been dealt with. There were no public executions, no dramatic trials. Raylan was too shrewd a king for that. The High Elder was quietly retired to a secluded monastery to meditate on his sins. The council members who had orchestrated the mirror ritual found themselves reassigned to the farthest, most inhospitable corners of the kingdom, their power and influence dissolving like morning mist. A new council was chosen, one based on loyalty and truth, not on bloodlines and secrets. The ghost of Lyra had not been seen since that day in the solar. With Raylan's heart no longer an anchor of unresolved grief, her hold on the mortal plane had crumbled. Evelyn sometimes wondered if the spirit had faded completely, or if it had simply moved on, its wolf soul finally free. She hoped, for Lyra's sake and for Raylan's, that it was the latter. The castle felt clean, its shadows no longer haunted by a queen's sorrow. She had filled the rooms with the scent of lavender and cedar, and it was now, finally, her home. A heavy warmth settled behind her, and two strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a solid, familiar chest. Raylan rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. "What is my queen thinking about so seriously?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. She smiled, leaning her head back against his. "About how much can change in 6 moons." "Everything has changed," he agreed, his grip tightening. "You changed it. You walked into my winter and brought the dawn." The poetic words spoken in his deep, earnest voice still had the power to make her heart flutter. The scarred, broken king, who had looked through her as if she were glass, now saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. He did not love a reflection of his past. He loved her with an intensity and devotion that was the bedrock of their new world. "I only held up a mirror, my king," she whispered. "You were the one who was brave enough to look into it and see the truth." He turned her in his arms, his stormy eyes soft with an emotion that was now as familiar to her as her own breath. Love, deep, abiding, and absolute. He gently touched the claiming mark on her neck, a beautifully intricate scar of swirling silver lines that mirrored the sigil on his own arm, their matching marks, a testament to their unique, hard-won bond. "The hunter's silverbane," he said, his expression turning serious. "My scholars have been studying it. It was more than a poison. It was an enchantment designed to sever the royal bloodline from its wolf spirit, to leave the throne vulnerable. It was not the work of simple marauders. There is another power at play, one that fears our strength." The threat was not over. Their kingdom was secure from within, but enemies still moved in the shadows beyond their borders. But the news no longer filled Evelyn with fear. She met his gaze, her own resolve a match for his. "Then we will face them together," she said, her voice clear and strong. He smiled, a true, deep smile that transformed his harsh features and made her heart ache with the beauty of it. "Together," he affirmed. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss filled with the promises of a shared future, of battles to be fought and a peace to be won. When he pulled away, he kept her close, their foreheads touching. Through the bond, she felt not just his love, but his complete, unwavering trust. He saw her not as an omega, not as a replacement, but as his equal, his queen, his other half. "My soul was a kingdom of one," he whispered against her lips. "Ruled by a ghost. Now it is a kingdom of 2. And as she looked into the eyes of the Alpha King who was her mate, her partner, her love, Evelyn Derthin, the quiet girl from a forgotten pack, finally understood. She was never meant to be remembered as someone else. She was destined to be the queen they would never forget.